On May 21, 2024, a 40-year-old British climber and his guide disappeared in Everest's death zone, just after reaching the mountain's 8,849-meter-high summit. What follows is a tragic story of an avoidable accident that led to the tragic end of two experienced climbers who otherwise would have completed the expedition successfully. The incident has once again focused media attention on the Everest climbing industry and overall management of the mountain. One would think that after 2023 was recorded as the deadliest climbing year in Everest's history, authorities would take action to prevent a repeat of that situation. In 2023, Nepal issued 478 climbing permits to foreigners and over 700 more to Sherpas and support staff. This was a staggering increase in the number of people attempting to reach the summit. And even though the harsh weather forced many climbers to go back home early, 17 people lost their lives during the summit attempt that year. The Nepalese government blamed the high death toll on climate change, but traditional mountain climbers have called the increasing boom in the commercialization of Everest a disrespect for the core values of mountaineering and a recipe for disaster. The days of climbing Everest solely for adventure and working together in the spirit of comradeship are over. Nowadays, anyone can decide to climb Everest to tick their bucket list, brag about it in a gathering of friends, or break a record of being the first person from their country to summit. It has become a tourist hotspot, attracting people from all over the world, including inexperienced climbers ready to spend as much as $100,000 to $120,000 to achieve their long life dream of getting to the top of the world. This has caused the mountain to become more crowded than ever, resulting in long, dangerous queues around the summit area. Experts are worried that the large crowds, along with climate change, is gradually causing the mountain to lose pieces of itself. Expedition companies, in the name of ensuring the safety of their clients, have also transformed the solitary and challenging adventure into a competition for who can provide the best itinerary plans for climbers, giving inexperienced climbers the impression that the climb is easy or they'll be fine just because they have a Sherpa who has summited Everest a few times. This mindset often results in these climbers making decisions that'll not only endanger their lives, but also put their Sherpas at great risk. But that's not the only thing to look out for. Everest is covered with over 30 tons of trash and waste left behind by climbers. Abandoned oxygen bottles, destroyed tents, bowls, and several other items are buried in the snow on the mountain. This blatant disregard for the mountain's pristine nature has sparked outrage all over the world, demanding the government to enforce strict rules that force climbers to leave the mountain with everything they brought. In 2019, the Nepalese government launched a 5-day cleaning campaign that removed over 4 tons of garbage from the mountain, but this barely scratched the surface. Several other cleaning campaigns have been launched, but this has only led to the discovery of more rubbish buried deep into the snow. The indigenous Nepalese people have ascribed the many deaths, short weather windows, and climatic changes as signs of the mountain gods fighting back after years of being disrespected. The Nepalese government has been urged to control the tourism business by requiring climbers to present evidence of their climbing experience before granting permits. But Nepal generates an average of $4 to $6 million from mountaineering permits alone. And even though the issues are as clear as day, is the government ready to adopt stricter measures that could possibly affect their revenue? While this is still being debated, the fact remains that there are just too many people on the mountain. And unless something is done, we can only expect more tragic accidents like this one. This isn't a story about people who dared the mountain, but one that highlights how the commercialization of Everest has caused another accident in 2024, an accident that should never have happened. In May 2024, a 40-year-old Daniel Paterson and his 23-year-old guide suddenly disappeared a few minutes after summiting Everest on Tuesday. Daniel, known to all as Dan, was from Wakefield, England, and was the co-owner of a popular gym in Wakefield. Dan was a fitness coach and personal trainer and had been in the fitness industry since 2007. He had gained experience working as a coach in several gyms and also as a personal trainer for hundreds of clients. Dan was athletic, so no one questioned his fitness or endurance level when he declared his intention to climb Mount Everest. His goal was to help raise money for the family of a gym member who had died from cancer. Dan was in great shape and had experience mountain climbing after having successfully summited 6,165-meter high Island Peak and 6,812-meter high Ama Dablam. In April 2024, Dan arrived in Nepal and registered with 8K Expeditions, one of the most popular expedition companies in Nepal. They had helped hundreds of their clients summit Everest and several other high-altitude mountains, including the dangerous K2. There, he was assigned to Pastenji Sherpa, a 23-year-old guide who had summited Everest twice, as well as several other 6,000-meter peaks. Pastenji Sherpa's experience with Everest started when he was a young boy. Before his first ever summit, Pastenji Sherpa had worked as a low-altitude carrier, transporting gear, food, and other supplies through the lower camps. He had slowly worked his way to the top and summited Everest, twice before he turned 23. This expedition was going to be his third. The trek to base camp usually takes about 7 to 12 days, and for Dan, it wasn't any different. He was part of a team of 15 with 8K Expeditions, and together they began the 124-mile or 200-kilometer trek to base camp at 5,400 meters. Because of the rise in inexperienced climbers, expedition companies often organize extensive training sessions for their clients. They would teach them the proper ways to get their gear on, how to attach their harness, adjust their oxygen tanks, and even how to wear their ice shoes correctly. They would also practice acclimatization rotations to get used to the route and familiarize their bodies with the different altitude changes. They would alternate between camps, from base camp through the ever-shifting Khumbu icefall to Camp 1 at 6,100 meters, slowly progress to Camp 2, then Camp 3, and then back down to base camp. Some expedition companies encourage their clients to summit other nearby peaks like Lhotse during these rotations. That way, their clients gain the needed experience and also add this to their list of summit achievements. After about 2 to 3 weeks of rigorous training, the team began their final ascent to Camp 4, where they would rest for a few hours before the summit push. The climb to Camp 4 requires more energy, and at this stage, many people start using their oxygen because of the thinning air. Everest is usually cold and windy all year round, and even when temperatures drop during the spring, climbers still have to face hurricane-force winds and bone-chilling cold. To minimize the risks of accidents, expedition companies would look out for the narrow time period when the skies are brighter and sunnier, providing a 3-day to 2-week-long window of good weather. 2024 came with about 5 days, and most of the expedition companies, including 8K Expeditions, planned their summit push around this period. On Sunday, May 19th, Dan's team got to Camp 4 at 7,900 meters or 26,000 feet. This was their final stop just before the dead zone, and here a lot of people fell sick with severe headaches and nausea. But one thing struck out to them. Camp 4 was already crowded with climbers like them. There were colorful tents strewn over the area with highly motivated climbers hoping to make their climb the next day. Dan and Pastenji Sherpa set up camp and proceeded to rest and conserve their energy before the final push. Climbers are generally advised to begin their summit climb around 1 to 3 a.m. so that they can summit by mid-morning and begin their descent when the weather is still clear. Because of the mountain's unpredictable weather, there is a 2 o'clock rule that says that anyone trying to summit the mountain should do so before 2 p.m. And if you don't get there by 2 p.m., you should turn around to avoid making the descent at night. Getting to the top of Everest is only half of the expedition, and descending is where things usually get tricky and fatal. Because of the exhaustion and euphoria of reaching the top, climbers often make rash decisions during their descent. Cold, hungry, and totally exhausted, all they're thinking about is how to get down as quickly as possible. Descending the mountain at night in such conditions will only increase your risk of missing a step and falling into one of the mountain's deep crevasses. The next morning, the duo woke up at around 1 a.m., checked their gear one last time, and began their trek to the summit. In front of them was a trail of lights from other climbers with the same goal. As they advanced into the death zone, their steps got slower, and they could only breathe through the supplemental oxygen tanks on their backs. In the death zone, very few people can climb without supplemental oxygen, and even though about 200 climbers have managed to get to the top without it, more than 100 of them died from hypoxia and other harsh effects of the lack of oxygen. Even people who get to the summit with oxygen tanks don't stay on it for too long because of the harsh weather and the fear of running out of oxygen. The duo fought their way through the steep slopes until they reached the balcony, where many climbers often stop to rest or swap their oxygen tanks. After a brief rest, they continued along the route towards Hillary's Step. At this point, they could see what seemed to be a long line of hundreds of people on the route leading all the way up to the summit. Climbers were neck to neck, with backpacks in the faces of people behind them. The duo soon found themselves in this traffic jam. The queue moved very slowly, with some climbers led by their Sherpas unclipping and then reclipping into the safety lines to bypass the traffic. The duo continued in line, taking one small step after the other and unclipping themselves anytime they had the chance. They continued this way, slowly making progress until they were facing the most challenging obstacle before the summit: the Hillary Step, a 12-meter rock wall that was incredibly difficult to climb. Thankfully, during climbing season, the Hillary Step is covered with frozen ice and snow that made it easier to navigate. But this still required climbers to be extremely cautious, as any misstep could send them plunging thousands of feet to their death. With climbers slowly making their way around the narrow ridge to get to the summit, Hillary Step was where the worst traffic jams occurred. At around 4:40 a.m., Dan and Pastenji Sherpa finally made it to the summit. They were now on top of the world. Excited by their successful ascent, the group atop Everest congratulated themselves, took photos, and also sneaked in a few brief minutes of rest before slowly making their way back down. Getting to the top was only half the journey, and now they had to make their way down the mountain before losing all of their energy and motivation. The long queue of climbers was still there, looking more like a one-way street with some people pushing their way to the top and another group trying to worm their way down. The route was too narrow for the number of climbers trying to move past it, but Dan and Pastenji Sherpa continued their descent. They were slowly advancing the bottleneck, when suddenly, the ice ledge they were standing on suddenly gave way, dragging 4 climbers down the eastern side of the mountain. It happened so fast, and the climbers who had lost their footing were dangling from their safety ropes. That was the only thing stopping them from disappearing into the void. The climbers clung desperately to the rope as some other climbers pulled them back up. But out of the 4 that fell, only 2 were pulled back up. Dan and Pastenji Sherpa had plunged further down the eastern Kangshung face of the mountain. This was the Chinese side of the mountain that has been left untraversed since the COVID period in 2019. Shortly after the incident, a search and rescue effort was initiated, but they had fallen in a different and more technical area of the mountain. The climbing season was also coming to an end, and sending a rescue team up the mountain, in spite of the harsh weather, was a suicide mission that none of the Sherpas dared to venture. Desperate for a positive outcome, Dan's partner, Rebecca, started a GoFundMe to fund the search for him. She claimed to have started the fundraiser after a world-renowned organization specializing in search and rescue operations in extreme environments advised her that search operations under such circumstances could cost about £200,000. The funds raised would be put towards helicopter flights, aerial support, specialized search teams, as well as logistical support. But all efforts to recover the climber were unsuccessful. Dan and his guide Pastenji Sherpa were declared missing and presumed dead, their bodies lodged somewhere in the mountains. Dan and Pastenji Sherpa's fate is even more infuriating, as their case isn't one of inexperienced climbers who refuse to heed the warnings of Sherpas. They were physically and mentally prepared for the climb and had successfully made it up the mountain. They possibly would have made it back down if they weren't caught in an unfortunate twist of events. The circumstances surrounding their fall has caused many to point fingers at the Nepalese government for negligence and overexploitation. Several videos have continued to surface, showing the long, scary queues on the way to the summit, yet the government has refused to set up any new regulations to control this. And now, it has resulted in the tragic end of these men. Looking at the staggering number of climbers on the narrow ridge that day, one can conclude that the mountain just couldn't bear the weight of that many people on its back anymore, causing them to fall to their deaths. Theirs is the case of an accident that never should have happened.